Good morning, everybody. It's a little bit earlier in the morning over here on the West Coast, but we're very, very excited to be gathering all you. I'm Deepti. I co-lead New Public with Eli, who's on this call too, and Talia, who isn't. And we're just really, really excited and grateful that all of you have taken a little bit of time this morning to kind of gather together with us to talk about the topic of trust. It really does feel like a moment for trust. I think it was with Eli that just last week we said it feels as though almost every institution it is crumbling or broken in some way. And so for us, this topic of trust, which is what we focused our second magazine on, is one it is that we really think about as we think about creating healthy digital public spaces, and particularly as we think about our relationship with public institutions. And so that's what we're excited to dig in with you today. And Kenny, if we can start the slides. So what we hope to spend the next 90 minutes doing is spending some time understanding New Public's perspective on this. That'll be short. And then very quickly digging into this magazine, which it is that I hope all of you have been able to spend a little bit of time with. We feel really, really grateful to have a lot of the authors, Kelly, Anna, Maggie, Katie here with us, and Wilford, the editor of our magazine, will take us through some conversation, reflection, and brainstorming about all the challenges it is that they've raised, but also some of the opportunities it is. And again, for us, this is as much about the content of the magazine as it is about the relationships that are in this space it is that we've created this morning. And so hope this really is an opportunity for everybody to get to know everybody else a little bit better. And what feels special about the way we're doing these events about this magazine is we've really invited partners that work with us that have been really critical to building New Public, but also some of you who have only experienced us through our digital assets. And this is the first time it is that you're really getting to put faces around the community, around New Public. And that feels really special, and want to share a very special welcome with all of you. And so the first thing we wanted to do, when we started New Public a few years ago, it really started with a research project, answering the question and dreaming a little bit about what would a digital public space look like that was healthy, that was flourishing, where everybody really felt welcome. And what that research, after talking to about 20,000 people all over the world, helped us build is this framework that we call the signals. And so you can go into the website and dig into all of this in a lot more detail. But the framework really is broken into four main pillars. Digital public space would need to be welcoming. It would need to really help people connect with one another, but not only connect, like deepen understanding of each other, and then really kind of enable and promote action. And so given that this morning, we are together creating this digital space on this Zoom together, we wanted to use the exact same framework to kind of create the guidelines and the norms and our objectives of the space it is that we're in. And so the first thing it is that we want to do is welcome all of you, but also ensure that we're really thinking about what the norms are of this space. And so really want to make sure that we create space for everybody to participate. And so, whether you are a partner of New Public or kind of joining us for the first time, please ensure that you feel comfortable making your voice feel heard, and for everybody else to also encourage that for others. We want to use the rules around you can share what it is that we're talking about, but But please don't attribute it to anybody, so that this space can be robust and people can feel like they can be really honest. And again, for us, what's most important is that, again, not only the content, but the way it is that we're reflecting on some of these topics very personally about trust, the public institutions that surround us, and then the opportunities it is that we have as we think about digital spaces. And so with that, Kenny, I turn it to Wilford, who has been the editor of both of our magazines. Some of you probably have read the first one on decentralization, which came out last year, and has really been at the helm of creating this one. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wilfred. I edited this issue of New Publics magazine, and I just want to tell you a bit about it. So, New Public does a lot of things, and one of the things that we try to do is bring our ideas in an accessible way to readers beyond, the usual communities that are already drawn to this work. So my mission with the magazine is always to take some of these concepts that are most pertinent in these discussions about designing healthy digital spaces, and to ask the human questions that lie beneath these sometimes more technical conversations. Our last issue, which we published last year, was about decentralization. When you hear that word, you think a lot about Web3 and those conversations, but we decided to take a slightly different tack and look at it from angles that didn't necessarily talk about blockchain and so forth head on. For trust, we also tried to do something similar, where we approach this topic from a lot of different angles. The idea behind this trust issue is that it's really, in our view, a variable that lies within a lot of other questions about tech's role in our lives. And that goes from everything from just like, how do you know if someone online is who they say they are, to what is the nature of a system like blockchain that claims itself to be trustless. And so if you read the magazine, in which there are 11 stories, you'll get a really nice spectrum of approaches to thinking about this question of trust's role in digital infrastructure. But one other thing that I think we try to emphasize is the role of power in talking about trust. When you think about the word trust, right, there's an implicit idea about consent in there. When someone that has someone or something has more power than you asks for your trust. What does that imply about the choice that you have and the relationship between those two parties, right? If a technical system determines through some kind of automated decision making that a marginalized person is less trustworthy, how does that person then do they have any recourse, right? And so these are some of the provocations that we took as a starting point for this issue of the magazine. And I'm really excited to welcome four of the authors for our for issue 2 of the magazine here today. We have Katie Knight, who is executive director of the Siegel Family Endowment. And also Siegel generously funded this issue of the magazine, and we're extremely grateful and excited to include Katie's writing actually in this issue of the magazine. We have Maggie Engler, who is a senior machine learning engineer at Twitter. And it was really a treat working with Maggie on her story, which I'll let her talk a little bit more about the role of zero trust cybersecurity in people's lives. And then we have Kelly and Anna Pendergrass from the duo that makes up Anti-Static, which is a globe-spanning team that does tech research and helped the New Zealand government look into how ordinary people feel about automated decision making in their lives. The idea of doing the magazine here is that we're going to emphasize the building block called Connect in New Public's signals framework. And that's really to, try to build bridges between groups, making power accessible, and try to bring in a lot of different perspectives and see what happens. So with that, I'm just going to launch into the panel. And we'll start by just letting everyone introduce themselves. Who are you and how did you come to this topic of trust in digital infrastructure? So I'd like to start with Katie. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you came to this topic.
Sure, thanks. I'm Katie. I'm the president and executive director of Siegel Family Endowment. We're focused on the impact of technology on society. So clearly a very broad mandate, and a lot of that work is really personal to me. I have spent my career sort of across nonprofit and tech jobs and see, I think, an interesting angle on the way in which a techno-utopian vision for the world that is sort of espoused and celebrated inside of many tech companies can be and has been, I think, causing some outward side effects out on the planet Earth, just to put it lightly. And so we take many different approaches to thinking about the intersection and overlap of tech and pervasive technology everywhere, and kind of the impact that has on the world we live in, and how we can leverage tech for good where it's possible, but also mitigate the risk and harm of tech. And so for me, the topic of trust felt like this really intuitive and ingrained notion in my own mind about, like, of course, we need trust in any relationship. You need trust. But I think as a society, and in terms of that intersection, there's not really a concentrated effort to build trust with these sort of institutions that are becoming our infrastructure. So whether we're talking about the technology that is built by or for governments to use and how they interact with citizens, or the non-governmental private platforms that have become so integral to our lives that they are like infrastructure, there's for me, like a really important sense that we need to be thinking about how we can create systems that are where people are more bought in and understand and have more of a relationship that is bi-directional rather than a single direction. We impose this upon you. And that's why thinking about trust, and coming from a nonprofit perspective, we talk about overhead a lot. So we just started talking about the notion that, like, investing in trust is sort of the overhead if you want to build and deploy a tech solution. Like, you have to think about the cost of trust and getting people to trust and wanting people to trust and doing trustworthy things as key, and as key as the code, as key as anything that's technical within the system.
That's awesome. And do you want to share a little bit about your argument in the piece and, why you chose to write about it?
Yeah, so I think I had, again, taken this notion of trust and wanted to make it feel a little bit more real. So I reflected, for me personally, just thinking about the last couple of years, obviously, and what we've all been through, and the ways in which tech and tech systems have played a role or not played a role in the rollout of vaccines, in sort of medical care management. And that for me was just a really compelling sort of place to position this argument and think about the ways in which things are not so simple as they appear, right? And so the notion of, like, medical mistrust and mistrust in government authorities in communities of color is really real to me, because I am part of multiple communities of color. I've experienced this, and I see it even in my own family, especially in older generations. I look at the hesitation around some of the government provided or promoted advice or programs that are out in the world, and just a general sense that if you believe in generational trauma, which I do, if you believe that within our histories and legacies, there is a lot that is material to how we interact with the world on a day-to-day basis, understanding, the history of the police being a slave catching operation, understanding the history of the Tuskegee experiments, understanding the history of forced sterilization of Black women. Like, there's so much that starts to make sense when you think about it through the lens of trust and how that might cause an ingrained distrust, and that's not just something to set aside and say, oh, well, like, those people don't deserve help or care or to be considered as part of the solutions here. It should be oh, wow, we need to think differently about how we approach these topics and problems so that we can build the trust that we are currently at a deficit in.
Thanks so much, Katie, and definitely want to return to some of those themes as we go on. I'd like to throw it to Maggie. Maggie, why don't you introduce yourself a little, and how did you come to this interest and topic in trust?
Yeah, definitely. So I have been working in sort of both the security and trust and safety space my entire career. It's interesting because one of the things that Katie mentioned was this idea of trust being bi-directional. So in some sense, like users, or if you're a digital system or a digital infrastructure, you need to work to build the trust of users. And at the same time, like, those systems need to figure out how to trust their users. So I've been super interested in kind of that dynamic. And I've been much more on the sort of defensive side when it comes to technical mechanisms for authentication. More recently, I've been working less in sort of cybersecurity and more in the trust and safety space. So looking at disinformation and other sort of abuses on Twitter. But having said that, I think that throughout, one of the things that I've noticed, and I also, I'm a lecturer at the School of Information at UT in a class called Human-Centered Data Science. And so one of the things that we're thinking deeply about, sort of in that class, is what would it look like to reimagine these systems, a lot of these systems, in a very human-centered way, whether that's both human-centered design and human-centered data science. And so I've kind of been interested in the ways in which people understand digital systems, and then how also sort of prevailing thought or prevailing design in information security or machine learning could exclude populations. And if you've had the chance to read the article, my research and my interviews were really centered around how the sort of mechanisms for authentication that have come into vogue, into practice, put more strain on lower sort of digital literacy, lower digital access populations. The people that I spoke to, there were a lot of, and I don't want to get too much into that just in this intro, but I think that there are a lot of ways that people use devices or people take advantage of digital public spaces that maybe the people who are designing these systems or data scientists working in tech aren't necessarily thinking about. And so that's kind of how I came to this topic, and it was definitely interesting, at least for me, I hope for readers as well, to sort of envision both what the potential implications of these trust requirements could be, and then at the same time, like, what they could or should look like.
Thanks so much, Maggie. And now throwing it over to Kelly and Anna. Tell us a bit about yourselves and how you came to this topic and the story that you did.
Hi everyone, I'm Anna Pendergrast, and along with Kelly, we're Anti-Static. We're a research and communications group based here in Wellington, New Zealand, where I live, and San Francisco, where Kelly lives. You also possibly figured out that we're sisters as well. And we work together mainly around issues on digital technology and also the environment, and specifically where they kind of intersect with people's lives. So we do a bunch of client work, but we also do our own writing practice as well. And it was through a combination of kind of both of those things that we came to this topic. And it also links in with some of our previous work. So most recently, we've looked at we did a literature scan recently on what an internet for good might look like, and also work around digital inclusion, so making sure people can access digital technologies in their day-to-day lives, which kind of links in with trust, and they were sort of our on-ramps. But I'll throw it over to Kelly.
Yeah, sure. I can say a little bit about how we came to this topic specifically. So I've got a bunch of seagulls flying around in the background. So as Anna said, we spend a lot of time thinking about technology, but also things like automation and the impact of technology on people's lives. So our work tends to be where, technology intersects with everyday people and how different inequities are kind of manifested in their lives and in those interactions. And so this essay specifically is kind of based on some findings from a research project that we worked on in 2020, which was about trust and automated decision-making in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so for that project, we were asked to look into people's trust in, or kind of lack of trust in, government, mostly government automated decision-making or algorithmic decision-making. And we learned, unsurprisingly, that trust isn't just something you can kind of force on people making good products and then folks will trust them. It also requires kind of trustworthiness from organizations making and implementing the technology and making decisions based on that technology. So it needs to be reciprocal. And then the findings for that project and the kind of the research methods that we used in the project really stuck with us. And so we were kind of interested in sharing some of the insights for a wider audience. And Anna, do you want to go ahead and say a little bit about this piece that we wrote?
Yeah, sure. So now the essay that we wrote about, and in terms of for this trust piece, was using this research that we did with folks from the Digital Council of New Zealand, who are a ministerial advisory group back in 2020, which was participatory research talking to over 180 people in different communities around New Zealand about their trust and comfort in automated decision-making. And as Kelly said, specifically government automated decision-making. And using that research as a jumping off point, we discussed that automation allows for increased speed, scale, and sometimes immutability, but they can have huge benefits, but especially for those people profiting and the folks that are getting efficiency gains. So without taking steps to build trust over time and involve users and diverse teams in the design and trust in digital systems design, we think that the trust is going to remain unevenly distributed as it is now. And we also found from this research that you can't necessarily automate your way to trust, and some of the narratives that we have around dominant narratives around technology is that automation and our algorithmic decision making can help reduce bias and end in a more trustworthy system. But we heard from people that unless people trust in the institutions administering the systems, they're not going to trust the outcomes of that automated system. And when that organization is a government agency, for many people that we talk to, and especially folks that have been subject to ongoing colonization, that trust just isn't there.
Right. So Anna, I want to grab onto something that you said at the end there. You can't automate your way to trust. And I think that that's a theme that recurs throughout a lot of the pieces in this magazine. But I want to dive into it and kind of like maybe take a conceptual step back and also think about this question of digital infrastructure, right? How do we think about digital infrastructure differently than traditional infrastructure, especially when it comes to this question of trust? Does it seem like we have to relearn all these lessons that we've already learned from centuries of building, traditional infrastructure in digital infrastructure? And why is there some kind of disconnect when we're now talking about building trust in digital infrastructure among these institutions that are trying to build them? Big questions, but curious what people's thoughts are. And yeah.
I can jump in first, but unless you wanted to, Katie.
Yeah.
No. Yeah, I guess with digital infrastructure, you both have the kind of physical aspects of that, from the cables and whatnot to right through to the hardware and the software. But you also, what we learned in our research and kind of more generally, is that you can have these systems, but unless there's trust between the people who are running them and the people that are affected by them, or relationships, it can be really tricky to have that trust. So you can, the trust in the system. So people want to kind of make this layer where trust isn't kind of necessary. But we heard time and time again, people want to know what's going on. They want to know, yeah, how the system is working and all of these kind of things. And if you kind of ignore that, I think that you're not going to have trust in the system. So unlike some other traditional infrastructures that we might think of when we think about infrastructure, from water pipes and whatnot, that we need to trust that they work and that they're doing their job. There's, I think, an extra kind of layer with the digital trust and digital infrastructures that we need to think about that might not be there with these kind of more traditional infrastructures we think of.
And Katie, I think you at the beginning of a thought there.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. And I think there's also this interesting complicating factor that I'm starting to grapple with, which is a lot of our physical infrastructure is old and was built at a time when trust in government was higher than it is right now. And so there's the piece of this that's like, so much digital infrastructure is effectively not a product of or subject to traditional government or governance regulations. Some of it is ungoverned on purpose. Some of it is governed by some default. Some of it is governed by the Facebook advisory board, like whatever it is, right? But I'm also curious, like, there was a time when one might have argued that an alternative to that is some sort of government control or a system of governance based on the traditional government that we're used to. And I think the more that may or may not have ever been a good idea, to be clear, but the less people trust governments and governance systems, which is sort of that slow erosion of trust, like the less likely that becomes a viable alternative either. So I think there's a piece here where we're complicating the complications. And then that's really at odds with the, scale fast and at all costs kind of mentality that has driven the tech industry for so long. And the obsession with scale is something that makes trust even harder to invest in and accomplish. And I think it requires us to take a step back and realize like that scale may look different for different things, and that sometimes a tech tool is not going to be the best solution because you're going to find yourself up against a wall when it comes to adoption because of a lack of trust.
Yeah, Maggie, I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I completely agree with both Anna and Katie. I think that there are these significant differences. If you think about like what sort of helps build trust with users or with people, like in some ways, right, they're like the ability to access information about that system, which in a physical infrastructure situation might be just walking around or like you can see it or touch it, which is not obviously usually not true with digital infrastructure. I think another point is that there's less, or there seems to be less sort of accountability in the digital space, both due to the lack of governance, as Katie mentioned, and sort of the global nature that it's less clear, like, oh, if something goes wrong, like, do I have a person to talk to? Is there someone that I can talk to or surface my concerns with? And then certainly like the personal relationship element, I think, plays in a lot as well, because so many of our sort of just biological predispositions towards trust rely on like interpersonal perception and interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, so that is actually a great segue into my next question, which is that there's a theme through all of your pieces about marginalized communities and how they approach this question of trust in digital infrastructure. And so I just wanted you to say a little bit about that, especially thinking about your own positionality as a writer, right? Talking about this question to, what's mostly going to be an audience of people who aren't as affected by some of the dynamics that you're bringing in the story, right? And so say a little bit about that experience, and then also, what you learned about navigating, going kind of against this, working against this power dynamic that marginalizes people through this piece, and what we can learn about it more broadly. So maybe I'll throw it back to Kelly and Anna.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think this was a really pertinent question for us throughout the whole process, both of working on this original 2020 research project and then also writing this piece. And it was really thinking about how to engage with people who were affected by digital systems and kind of automated decision-making was a core part of the kind of the research method behind the process, behind the project. And so the core of the project that led to our piece was this participatory research with groups of people who are affected by automated decision making, and particularly government systems were kind of brought together to share their perspective. And so that included Māori and Pacifica youth, disabled people, young people with experience in the care system, and like women with migrant and refugee backgrounds. And so the design team, the participatory design team that kind of led those engagements, spent a lot of time thinking about the trust question before they even engaged with these communities. And so that meant kind of like building relationships with representatives from these different communities, helping to, develop clear and respectful and equitable and non-extractive relationships. And then having these conversations in contexts that felt appropriate and were kind of like appropriate to the community and kind of like, led by the community. Because I think a lot of folks, especially from more marginalized groups, have had so much experience having government consultations and nonprofit consultations where a researcher will come in, extract a bunch of information and then not really reciprocate in any way other than 6 months later, maybe you can read the report. And so it was really important to this project not to be part of that same system. And as usual, we couldn't guarantee what change would come out of the engagement process, but it was important to us that the process itself was respectful, especially because this project really centered the voices of those people. And so the methodology that was used for the research was kind of interesting and important, and you can read more about that in our piece. And then in the research itself, we really aimed to center people's voices by quoting people specifically and really building the insights around what people had to say. Because I think a lot of what we heard from folks was that people felt like they should participate in the process of building this digital infrastructure that was going to affect them, and that people should be included from the beginning, have their voices heard throughout the process, and be involved in actually, making the process and making sure that the outcomes are things that are appropriate for them and their communities.
So it's like an idea of democratizing the building of the infrastructure as well.
Absolutely, and ideally finding out ways to share power more equitably, so not just having government and consultants always be the ones to build and own it, but also ideally, and a lot of this is in the future, thinking about how that power can be shared. And Anna, I don't know if you want to jump in and just say anything about our kind of positionality before we move on.
I guess just
yeah,
go ahead, Wilfred.
Oh no, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, cool, thank you. And I guess just to add to what Kelly was saying, we're really cognizant in our writing, both for this project and more generally, of the position that we write, especially when we write in a New Zealand context. We've got privilege as Pākehā, so European New Zealanders, and with the responsibilities as tangata tiriti, which means, roughly translated, people who have the right to live here in New Zealand as the result of the Treaty of Waitangi, or Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So we need to be really cognizant of that. And we also acknowledge that we ourselves haven't had to interact with many of the automated decision-making systems that we wrote about for this research. So we haven't had to apply for immigration or parole, or in recent years, social support. So all of these processes are often automated, and we benefit from being individualized in a lot of these systems. I think we also learned through this process a lot that there are so many, obviously, perspectives to looking at one issue, and we learned in hindsight that we could have talked to Māori experts earlier in the process and had more of a collaborative process. Because we learned through the research that trust doesn't have a commensurate word in Te Reo Māori, and the Western concept of trust isn't really one of the key issues for Māori when it comes to navigating relationships and power. So some of the Māori researchers we worked with emphasised the importance of being able to frame questions in ways that align with Māori concepts and worldviews. And so that was something that we learned late in the game, and that we would definitely bring to other projects, and needing to kind of frame projects from the very beginning in ways that work for different people, and not just reinforcing one Western perspective.
I want to change up the order a little, so we'll go to Maggie. And curious, a lot of resonances there with your projects, I think, but yeah.
No, definitely a big overlap in terms of sort of general goals and what I sought out to accomplish. I think that starting from this kind of point of zero trust and the ways in which sort of technically trust might be established. And this is people who are familiar with sort of zero trust already know, but like multi-factor authentication being one of the big pillars of that. I really started from thinking through like the kind of factors of multi-factor authentication. One is something you know, and then one is something you have, and then the other one is something you are. But really focused, I kind of zoned in on that something you have, because it struck me that sort of this is like an easy enough, like cute little way of remembering how these systems work. But if you don't have those personal device, or if you don't have a personal device, you're sort of completely excluded from using anything that relies on that authentication method. And so that was kind of the first thing that I was interested in, and to investigate sort of the folks. So I really was just looking at the beginning for sort of people without a personal device, or who didn't have necessarily like a smartphone or something like that. But what I found in sort of doing that research is that really wasn't the barrier. I mean, that was certainly a barrier, but what often happened in the folks that I spoke with, like it wasn't necessarily just that, oh, I didn't have a smartphone, or I was sharing a phone with my spouse or a family member, but it was that compounded with, oh, I rely on this. I don't necessarily have my own phone, but have infrequent work, and so I really need like this communication for picking up gigs, for example. Or and another one that came up a lot was language barrier. So I live in Austin, I mentioned, and all of the folks that I spoke to live in Austin as well. We have a lot of native Spanish speakers. So it was very enlightening to understand like how these kind of intersections contributed to the overall experience and overall frustration with all of these processes, or all of these kind of from online banking systems to email providers and things like that, because really it wasn't necessarily one thing, but the combination of identities that people had. And I think that one of the sort of ways in which we like or I guess almost like solutions that both the nonprofit that I worked with is really doing a great job of this, sort of providing digital access and literacy training. And then I mentioned some of what the city is doing as well in terms of providing refurbished devices and things like that. So I think digital access can be a great way to sort of alleviate that, but it doesn't necessarily solve all of these different overlapping issues, but maybe can stop them from compounding on each other. And the final thing that I was going to just mention was that one of the folks who responded, an early reader, responded on the subject of kind of the comparison to physical infrastructure, pointed out that when people don't have cars, for example, like we provide public transportation, or there are public options for transportation, which may be more or less dependable depending on where you are, of course. But so what is the digital equivalent of that, of public transportation? And in the case of several of my interviewees, those were libraries. But again, those are suffering kind of the same, and I saw a comment about this, kind of the same challenges of other physical or other institutions today. So funding is always a challenge, and certainly, yeah, certainly a very, very valuable resource. But how are we propping that up, and how are we keeping those resources up to date with the technological needs, which of course move very quickly?
Absolutely. So Katie, I'm going to give you the last word for this panel before we jump to the breakout section of this event. Yeah, what are your thoughts on what people just said, and from your own experience, doing this work?
Yeah, well, I think there's several pieces here, and we could probably spend a really long time on this, but I will try not to. I think related to what everyone has said, it feels like one of the things that strikes me, and this comes back to me time and again, is like marginalized people or historically marginalized people are often like not asked about how things impact them. And to Kelly's earlier point, like very rarely are they involved in the process of building the systems. And I think even on the traditional infrastructure front, I will go down in infamy calling for like death to the public comment period, because it's the most useless form of soliciting community input on a project, because it's like, here's a forum to voice your complaints on this fully baked plan that we're going to roll forward with anyway. And so how do we like shift that paradigm in traditional infrastructure and digital infrastructure? That is a really important question. And I think reflecting on the sort of broader global perspective in more and more circumstances has been really enlightening for me, because to some of the points in the comments and some of the points that my fellow panelists have made, like in places where historically marginalized people in the US are not marginalized people, they are just people, or they are people who have had a different experience, there are different paradigms for how we do these things. And I think if we can remove ourselves from the default and reflect on how we might incorporate people both in our sort of current practical sense where they are in this world, but also reflect on kind of a global perspective on just a different way of being and doing, that we might make positive change like at scale, at a meaningful scale, that would allow us to build better and to build things that work for more people and help them solve the problems that they have, or address the needs they want fulfilled, or ideally like thrive in society, which is our ultimate goal.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. I'm going to hand it now back to Kenny, who will introduce the next section of the event.
Hi, everyone. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Kenny Andrzejewski. I'm the events lead for New Public. And I get the privilege of transitioning us to our breakout sessions. Before we do that, I want to bring us back to the civic signals and our building block of understanding or understand, and our belief that our digital spaces should help us better understand each other and provide context that helps us agree on the fundamental shared reality of what we're seeing and experiencing. So we're going to have 2 breakout sessions. Each of them are going to be about 15 minutes, and you're going to be in groups of 3 to 4. We really want to focus, especially in this first breakout, on elevating shared concerns and promoting thoughtful conversation. So we want to, in that vein, we want to ground it in a sense of reflection and our personal and lived experiences. As you know, we've signaled to a lot in this introductory panel. Thank you for our authors and panelists for really grounding us in that perspective. I've posted a Jamboard link in the chat, and we're really hoping today that the ideas and reflections that you come up with can be captured in this Jamboard. As we're signaling from knowledge and network building to product building at New Public, we really want to generate and surface the ideas that we should be focusing on. And in that process, we also want to be making sure that we're building with people and we're giving attribution to the ideas where they come from. So you'll see that panel on the right side of the different Post-it notes. Please associate your name with your ideas as they're coming up. And we want to be in conversation with you around these. And the questions, I will throw these in the chat as well. But the questions that we're going to focus on for this first breakout are in the slide right there, and now they're in the chat as well. We'll have each of the panelists in the rooms with you to help move this conversation along. But the first question is, when was the time that the required use of technology didn't work for you, and as a result, it caused you to lose trust in a public institution or caused real harm for you in your life? If it adds context, how does that still affect you today? So with that in mind, we're going to send you all to breakout rooms for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back shortly, and then we'll go back. So yeah, please take the time to get to know each other quickly, briefly, because you only have about 15 minutes. But then try to make sure everyone has an opportunity to share on this question, and hopefully that will build towards a really, really generative and constructive conversation when we come back to the second breakout. Thank you, and we'll be able to hop into rooms and help you out if need be. But we will see you all in 15 minutes.